The BOWER, a tale of black anise, written by Mikey of Saltlinesstudio. There is a village in Leicestershire whose name I will not write. Not because I have forgotten it. I remember everything about that place, down to the particular gray of its stones and the way sound carried differently at its edges, but because some truths are not meant to be found by those who go looking for them. The village exists. It sits at the foot of the Dane Hills, where the land rises towards something older than churches, older than roads, older than the memory of the men who first cleared the woods and called themselves owners of the soil. You will not find it on any map published in my lifetime, and I suspect you will not find it on any map published in yours. This is not an accident. Maps are made by men who believe the world can be measured and contained, and there are places that resist such certainty. I came to the village in the autumn of my 32nd year, in the reign of our late King Edward, hired to catalogue the library of the Reverend Edmund Ashworth, who had died without heirs and left behind 3,000 books and 60 years of accumulated silence. The solicitors in Leicester had warned me that the collection was peculiar. Their word, delivered with the particular carefulness of men who did not wish to say more than they knew. I had smiled at this. I had catalogued peculiar collections before. I had handled manuscripts that made theologians uncomfortable and naturalists suspicious. I had spent 3 months in the Hebrides sorting through the papers of a man who believed he had discovered proof of the flood, and another 6 weeks in Cornwall with a collection of grimoires that a deceased baronet had acquired from sources he had declined to name. I did not believe there was anything in a country parson's library that could unsettle me. I arrived in late October, when the hedgerows were burning with hips and haws, and the fields had been stripped to stubble. The train from Leicester deposited me at a small station, whose name I will also not write, and from there I walked the 4 miles to the village along lanes that grew progressively narrower and less certain of their direction. The sky was the color of pewter, low and heavy, and the light had a quality I had not encountered before. Flat, somehow, as if the sun were shining through gauze. Twice, I passed farmsteads set back from the road, their windows dark, their yards empty of the usual signs of rural life. No dogs barked at my approach. No children watched from doorways. The only sounds were my own footsteps and the occasional complaint of a crow in the bare branches overhead. The cottage arranged for my lodging stood at the village's northern edge, where the last of the cultivated land gave way to rougher ground, bracken and gorse climbing toward the tree line of the Dane Hills. My landlady was a widow named Mrs. Parrish, a woman of perhaps 60 whose face had the weathered composure of someone who had outlived several certainties. She showed me to my room with few words, pointed out the well and the privy and the cupboard where she kept the candles, and told me that supper was at 6 and breakfast at 7, and that she did not serve meals outside of these hours, except in cases of genuine emergency, which she would determine at her own discretion. It was only as she was leaving that she paused at the door, her hand resting on the frame, her back still turned to me. "You'll not go walking on the hills after dark," she said. I asked her, why? "Because I'm asking you not to." She did not turn around. Her voice was flat, without inflection, as if she were reciting something she had said many times before. "The paths are treacherous in the dark. The ground is uneven. People have been known to fall." "I appreciate your concern," I said, "but I have walked in difficult terrain before. I am not entirely without experience." She turned then and looked at me with eyes that held something I could not name. Not anger, not fear, but something older and more complicated, a weariness that went beyond tiredness. "I am asking you," she said again, "not to go walking on the hills after dark. That is all I can do. Ask," and then she was gone, her footsteps retreating down the narrow stairs with a heaviness that seemed deliberate, as if she were pressing herself more firmly into the world with each step. I thought nothing of it. Or rather, I thought what any reasonable man would think. that country people have their superstitions, their local fears, their inherited anxieties about places and times that have accumulated meaning over generations. Every village has its local devil, its stretch of road where horses balk, its field where the corn grows thin, and the crows will not land. These things are quaint. They are the residue of older fears, the fossils of beliefs that no longer have living adherents but have not yet finished dying. I was a modern man with a commission from a Leicester solicitor and a train ticket back to London in my pocket. I did not believe in local devils. I unpacked my bags, arranged my pens and notebooks on the small desk by the window, and looked out at the hills rising dark against the evening sky. The light was failing now, the pewter sky deepening toward iron, and the trees on the Dane Hills stood stark and black against the fading glow. They were mostly oak, those trees, old oaks, their branches bare now, twisted into shapes that seemed almost deliberate, as if they had been trained over centuries to grow in particular directions for particular purposes. One tree in particular caught my attention. It stood apart from the others at the wood's edge, perhaps 50 yards from where the cultivated ground ended and the wilder land began. Its trunk was split and hollow. I could see that even at this distance, in this failing light, and its crown spread wide and dark against the sky, wider than seemed natural for an oak of its apparent height. There was something about its silhouette that made me want to look away. A wrongness I could not identify, but could not ignore. The branches seemed to reach in too many directions at once, and the hollow at the trunk's base was darker than it should have been, darker than the gathering dusk could account for. I did not look away. I stood at the window until the light failed entirely, until the tree became indistinguishable from the general darkness of the hill, until I could no longer be certain where the sky ended and the land began. And even then, I continued to stare, as if by looking long enough, I might understand what had disturbed me about that solitary oak standing guard at the forest's edge. That night, I dreamed of teeth grinding in the dark, a slow, rhythmic sound, like millstones turning, like something patient and vast working its way through matter that had once been solid. I woke with the sound still echoing in my ears, and lay in the darkness of my unfamiliar room, and listened to the silence of the village, and did not sleep again until dawn. The Reverend Ashworth's library occupied the entire upper floor of the old rectory, a long room with windows on 3 sides that should have been filled with light. But the glass was thick and greenish, the kind they made a century ago, when glass was still an imperfect art, and it gave the room a subaqueous quality, as if everything within it were preserved in murky water. Dust motes hung motionless in the pale beams that filtered through, and the air had the particular smell of old paper and older secrets, that musty sweetness of books that have been closed for decades, their pages slowly surrendering their moisture to the indifferent years. The books themselves were arranged without apparent system. Theology beside botany, sermons stacked atop folklore collections, manuscripts in 3 languages shelved spine to spine with penny dreadfuls and volumes of popular verse. Here was Augustine's City of God sharing a shelf with a treatise on the cultivation of turnips. There was a first edition of Paradise Lost propping up a stack of pamphlets about the care and breeding of ferrets. It would take me months, I realized, to make sense of the collection. Perhaps longer. The Reverend Ashworth had been a man of wide and undisciplined interests, and he had acquired books the way some men acquire debts, compulsively, without regard for consequence, and with no apparent intention of ever bringing order to the chaos he created. I began my work methodically, as I always did. I started at the eastern wall and worked my way around the room, removing each book from its shelf, recording its title and author and condition in my notebook, and replacing it in its original position until such time as a proper organizational scheme could be devised. It was tedious work, but I found it soothing. There is a comfort in catalogues, in the imposition of order upon chaos, in the knowledge that everything has its place and every place its thing. But I noticed, within the first week, that certain subjects recurred with a frequency that could not be coincidental. The reverend had collected everything he could find about the Dane Hills. Maps going back to the 16th century, showing the changing boundaries of the forest and the slow encroachment of cultivated land. Agricultural surveys from 3 different reigns, documenting the productivity of farms at the hill's edge and noting, with bureaucratic blandness, that certain parcels of land had been abandoned without explanation. Parish records of births and deaths, marriages and baptisms, stretching back 200 years, and annotated in the reverend's careful hand with symbols and abbreviations I did not immediately understand. And folklore. Dozens of pamphlets and manuscript pages about the old beliefs of Leicestershire, gathered from oral sources and antiquarian journals, and private correspondence with scholars who had died before I was born. The reverend had cast his net wide, collecting variants of the same stories from different villages, comparing versions, noting discrepancies and consistencies with the meticulousness of a man who believed that truth could be sifted from the accumulated sediment of human fear. The name Black Anise appeared in nearly every source. I had heard the name before. Who hasn't? Who has read anything of English folklore? The hag of the Dane Hills, the blue-faced witch who dug her cave with iron fingernails and waited in the branches of an oak tree for children who wandered too far from home. John Hayrick had written of her in his poem of 1797, describing her vast talons, foul with human flesh, and her livid face. She was a cautionary tale, the sort of thing nurses told to frighten their charges into obedience, the sort of monster that emerged from the dark corners of the nursery to punish children who would not sleep or would not eat their porridge or would not stop asking questions that had no good answers. I had assumed the stories were local color, no more substantial than tales of boggarts or black dogs, or the various spectral coaches and headless horsemen that populate the folklore of every English county. Every region needs its monsters. Every darkness needs a name. But the Reverend Ashworth had not collected these materials as curiosities. His marginalia made that abundantly clear. He had annotated everything with a careful, cramped hand, cross-referencing dates and locations, marking certain passages with symbols whose meanings I gradually decoded over the following days. A small cross indicated a disappearance. A circle indicated a sighting or report. A triangle indicated physical evidence, though evidence of what I could not yet determine. He had created an index. I found it tucked into a volume of John Herrick's poetry that listed every recorded disappearance in the parish going back 200 years, arranged by date and annotated with the age and description of the missing person. Children, mostly, but also a shepherd in 1743 who had gone looking for a lost ewe on the Dane Hills Road and never returned. A tinker in 1801 whose cart had been found at the edge of the wood, his horse still in its traces, his goods undisturbed, but of the man himself no sign. A young woman named Mary Sims in 1856, who had been walking home from her aunt's cottage on the Dane Hills Road on a November evening and was never seen again. Her bonnet had been found the following spring, caught in the branches of a blackthorn bush half a mile from where she should have been. But of Mary herself, there was no trace. The Reverend had noted, at the bottom of the index, in handwriting that trembled slightly, the intervals are not random. Something governs them. I, Father, cannot see the pattern, but I feel it. 3 years sometimes. 7 years, more often. Never more than 12. The hunger builds. And then it must be fed. I closed the index and returned it to its place in the Hayrick volume. My hands, I noticed, were not entirely steady. I told myself, this was the obsession of an isolated man. Country clergymen, especially bachelor clergymen, often develop eccentricities. They have too much time and too few parishioners, and the mind seeks occupation where it can find it. The Reverend Ashworth had spent 60 years in this village, watching children grow old and die, presiding over funerals, walking the same lanes and fields until the landscape became a kind of madness. Of course, he had begun to see patterns in the dark. Of course, he had convinced himself that the old stories were more than stories. What else was there for him to believe in? At the end of a long life spent in the shadow of hills that never changed, I catalogued his collection methodically. I did not dwell on the folklore. I did not add his observations to my notes. I was a professional, and professionals do not allow themselves to be distracted by the delusions of their subjects. But at night, alone in Mrs. Parrish's cottage, I found myself thinking about the hollow oak on the hill. I had not looked at it again since that first evening. I had not allowed myself to look. Every morning, I walked to the rectory by a route that kept the hills at my back, and every evening I returned by the same route, my eyes fixed on the road ahead, my attention carefully directed toward anything but the tree line at the village's edge. And yet, I knew the oak was there. I could feel its presence the way you can feel someone watching you in a crowd. A pressure at the edge of awareness, a weight that the conscious mind refuses to acknowledge, but the older parts of the brain, the parts that remember when we lived in trees and feared the dark, cannot ignore. I knew, without looking, that the hollow at the tree's base was darker than it should be. I knew that the branches spread too wide, reached too far, twisted in directions that healthy trees do not grow. And I knew, with a certainty, I could not explain and did not want to examine, that if I looked too long at that darkness, something might look back. November came with rain that seemed personal. Not storms, not the dramatic downpours of autumn giving way to winter, but a steady gray persistence that turned the lanes to mud and kept the village indoors. The sky pressed low over the Dane Hills, erasing the distinction between cloud and hilltop, and the days shortened until it seemed that dusk arrived before noon had properly established itself. I continued my work in the library, my cataloging proceeding more slowly than I had anticipated. The reverend's collection was larger than the solicitors had suggested, and more disordered, and I had begun to suspect that he had deliberately hidden certain materials, shelving them among unrelated volumes so that they would only be found by someone patient enough to examine every book. It was in the second week of November that I found the journal. It had been tucked inside a collection of agricultural reports from 1832, its leather binding cracked and water-stained, its pages warped with age. At first glance, it appeared to be a ledger of some kind, the same format as 100 other account books in the collection, the same cramped lines, the same faded ink. But when I opened it, I found not figures but words. The reverend's handwriting filled every page, smaller than his marginalia, cramped and hurried, as if he had been writing against time, against forgetting, against the temptation to leave certain things unsaid. The entries began in 1897 and continued until the previous spring, until I realized with a small shock, just weeks before his death, 60 years of observation, 60 years of watching and recording and trying to understand. The journal was not a confession or a memoir, but something rarer and more unsettling. A case file, evidence, the accumulated data of a man who had spent the better part of a lifetime trying to prove something that should not need proving and should not be true. I should not have read it. It was not part of my commission. The solicitors had hired me to catalog the books, not to pry into the private writings of a dead clergyman. But the first page fell open to an entry that caught my eye, and once I had read the first line, I could not look away. October 15th, 1897. The Croft child has been missing for 3 days now. Her name is Sarah. 8 years old. Fair hair, like her mother's. She was playing in the orchard behind the farmhouse, picking windfalls for cider, and when her mother looked again, she was gone. There was no cry, no commotion. She was there, and then she was not. The absence was so sudden and so complete that her mother stood in the orchard for a full 5 minutes, calling her name, unable to believe that a child could disappear so entirely from the world without leaving some trace, some echo, some evidence that she had ever existed at all. The men have searched the hills, the woods, the old quarry, the abandoned barns, every hedgerow and ditch within 3 miles of the village. They will not search the BOWER. When I suggested it, Thomas Croft looked at me as if I had spoken blasphemy. And perhaps I had, of a kind. We do not speak of such things here. We have learned not to speak of them. But silence does not make a thing untrue. Silence only means that the truth must find other ways to be remembered. I walked to the edge of the wood this evening, alone. I did not enter. I stood at the boundary where the cultivated land ends and the older ground begins, and I listened. There was no sound, not birdsong, not wind in the branches, not the usual settling and stirring of a forest at dusk. Only silence, a silence so complete that I could hear the blood moving in my own ears, could hear my own heart beating, could hear each breath I took entering and leaving my body as if breathing itself had become an act of tremendous noise in that vast and terrible quiet. The hollow oak stood 50 yards away, its trunk split and dark. I did not look at it directly. I have learned over the years not to look directly, but I knew it was there. I could feel it the way you feel a presence in a darkened room, the way you know that something is watching, even when you cannot see the eyes. And I knew, with a certainty that had nothing to do with reason or evidence or faith, that something was looking back. Sarah Croft will not be found. I know this as surely as I know my own name. She is gone where the others went. The shepherd in 1743, the tinker in 1801, Mary Sims in 1856. All the nameless children whose disappearances were noted in the parish records only as removed by providence, or taken by illness, or, in the older documents, simply claimed. The language changes, but the truth remains the same. Something waits beneath the Dane Hills, something old and patient and hungry. And every few years, when the hunger grows too great to be contained, it feeds. I closed the journal and sat for a long time in the gray light of the library, listening to the rain against the windows and the silence beneath the rain. My hands were trembling, not from cold, though the library was cold, but from something else, something I did not want to name. Fear, perhaps, or recognition, or the terrible vertigo that comes when the ground you have built your life upon begins to shift beneath your feet. That evening, I asked Mrs. Parrish about the Croft family. She was standing at the stove, her back to me, stirring something that smelled of onions and stock and the comfortable warmth of a kitchen that had seen 1,000 such evenings. Her hand stopped moving. The wooden spoon rested against the side of the pot, motionless, for what felt like a very long time. 3 heartbeats. 4. Then she resumed her stirring. And when she spoke, her voice was perfectly level, perfectly calm. There's no family by that name in the village. But there was. In 1897. A farmer named Thomas Croft and his daughter Sarah. There's no family by that name. She did not turn around. Her back was rigid, her shoulders set, her entire body held with a stillness that spoke of tremendous effort, as if she were preventing herself from doing something, fleeing, perhaps, or weeping, or simply refusing to hear what I was saying. We don't speak of old troubles here. It doesn't do any good. It doesn't bring anyone back. It only keeps the wounds open when they ought to be allowed to heal. Mrs. Parrish. Supper will be ready in 10 minutes. Her voice brooked no argument. You should wash your hands. I let the matter drop. But I could not unsee the stillness of her hand against the pot, the 4 heartbeats of silence before she chose her lie, the rigid set of her shoulders as she refused to turn and face me. She knew. Of course, she knew. Everyone in this village knew. They had known for generations, had learned the truth at their mother's knees, and had passed it to their children in turn. And they had also learned something else, that there are truths which cannot be spoken, which can only be lived with, which must be carried in silence like a stone in the pocket or a thorn in the flesh. The village had made its peace with the thing beneath the hill. Not a happy peace, not a triumphant peace, but the only peace available to those who cannot fight and will not flee. They had learned to live with the darkness at their doorstep, and the price of that accommodation was a silence so deep and so complete that it had become indistinguishable from forgetting. Except they had not forgotten. Not really. You could see it in the way they kept their children close, in the shuttered windows after dark, in the paths that were never walked, and the names that were never spoken. The knowledge was there, beneath the surface, passed down in warnings and prohibitions, and the small daily acts of caution that had become so habitual they seemed like nothing more than local custom. They remembered. They simply refused to remember out loud. I returned to the journal. I could not help myself. Over the following days, I read through decades of the Reverend Ashworth's observations. The entries spanned 30 years, and they told a story the village had agreed not to tell. Every few years, sometimes 3, sometimes 7, never more than 12, someone would disappear from the edges of the parish. Usually a child. Usually in autumn, when the days grew short, and the nights came early, and the woods took on that particular quality of darkness that seems to swallow light rather than merely lacking it. The searches would find nothing. The families would grieve. The church would hold a service, prayers for the lost, hymns for the grieving, and then the silence would close over the wound like water closing over a stone, and life would continue as if nothing had happened. The Reverend had documented each disappearance with meticulous care. He noted the dates, the locations, the age and description of the missing person, the weather conditions, the phase of the moon. He cross-referenced his findings with the older records he had collected, extending his pattern back through centuries, comparing the intervals and the circumstances, and the gradual evolution of the stories people told themselves to explain what could not be explained. And he had drawn a map. I found it folded inside the journal's back cover, showing the boundaries of the parish, the roads and footpaths, the position of every farm and cottage, the contours of the Dane Hills rising dark and ominous at the parish's northern edge. At the center of the hills, marked with a circle and a cross, 2 words in the Reverend's careful hand: the BOWER. I knew what the BOWER was. Every account of Black Annis mentioned it. The cave she had carved from the living rock with her iron fingernails. The hollow beneath the hill where she waited through the long years between her hungers. The folklore described it as a dank, narrow opening at the base of a limestone outcrop, hidden by bracken and the roots of the hollow oak that stood guard above it. The story said that the walls of the cave were scored with long parallel grooves, as if something had clawed at the stone for centuries, wearing channels into the rock with the patience of water or wind. The story said that the floor of the cave was soft with the accumulated matter of generations, and that the smell of the place was like nothing else in the world. Not rot exactly, not death exactly, but something older and more fundamental, the smell of the earth itself when the earth is hungry. The stories said that no one who entered the BOWER had ever returned. But the Reverend had visited it. His journal made that clear. On the night of the new moon in October 1912, when he was 57 years old and had already spent a quarter of a century documenting the thing beneath the hills, he had walked alone to the edge of the wood, passed beneath the branches of the hollow oak, and descended into the darkness below. I do not know what I expected to find, he wrote, in handwriting that trembled visibly on the page. I brought a lantern and a rosary and the faith of 40 years' ministry. I brought the name of God and the words of Scripture and the certainty, or what I believed to be certainty, that no darkness could stand against the light I carried. I told myself that I was doing God's work, that to know evil was to fight evil, that the truth would set me free. I was wrong. The BOWER is real. It is exactly where the old stories said it would be, exactly as they described it. The opening is narrow. I had to crawl the first 10 yards on my hands and knees, my lantern held before me, my rosary clenched in my teeth. The stone was cold and damp, and the darkness pressed against me like something physical, like a weight I was pushing through. But the tunnel widened as I went deeper, and soon I could stand. And then the ceiling rose above me and was lost in shadows the lantern could not penetrate. The cave goes deeper than any natural formation should go. The walls are scratched, long parallel grooves in the stone, running from floor to ceiling, as if something had clawed at them for centuries, as if something had been trying to escape, or trying to wear the cave larger, or simply expressing a rage that had no other outlet. I ran my fingers along the grooves, and they were sharp still, sharp enough to draw blood. Whatever made them is still making them. The walls are still being carved. And at the back of the cave, in the deepest darkness, I found what I had been looking for and what I had hoped not to find. I will not describe it. There are some things that should not be described, because the act of description gives them power, gives them shape, gives them entry into the minds of those who hear the description and cannot unhear it. I will say only this. The old stories are true. All of them. Every terrifying detail that parents have whispered to children for 1,000 years. Every warning that was passed down through generations before writing was invented to preserve it. Every fearful imagining that kept our ancestors awake in their caves and their huts and their cottages. All of it is true. And all of it falls short of the truth. The thing that waits in the BOWER is older than the stories, older than the hills, older than the memory of men. It was here before us, and it will be here after us, and it does not care about our prayers, or our faith, or our desperate need to believe that the world is just and comprehensible and safe. It did not harm me. I do not know why. Perhaps I was too old. The stories say it prefers the young, prefers the tender flesh of children who have not yet learned to fear it, who can still be lured from safety with the promise of something sweet or bright or beautiful. Perhaps my faith protected me, though my faith felt very thin in that darkness, very small, very far from the God I had served for 40 years. Or perhaps it simply was not hungry. Perhaps I had come between feedings, and it looked at me the way a sated cat looks at a mouse, with interest, with a kind of lazy consideration, but without the urgent need that drives the hunt. I left the BOWER as the first light was breaking in the east. I crawled back through the narrow tunnel and emerged beneath the hollow oak, and I lay on the cold ground and wept like a child. I have not returned. I will not return. But I know now that my duty is not to defeat the thing beneath the hill. No man could do that. No faith is strong enough, no weapon sharp enough, but to remember it, to keep its truth alive in a world that prefers to forget, to pass on the warning to those who come after me in the hope that they will be wiser than I was, or at least more fortunate. I put down the journal and walked to the window. The afternoon was dying into evening, and the Dane Hills rose dark against the fading light. The hollow oak was visible at the wood's edge. I could not avoid seeing it now, could not pretend I did not know what it marked. Its branches spread against the sky like the fingers of a reaching hand, like the limbs of something that had been frozen in the act of grasping, and the darkness at its base was deeper than the gathering dusk could account for. I should have left. I know that now. Looking back across the years that separate me from that moment, I should have packed my bags that evening, walked to the station in the next village, and taken the first train back to London. I could have told the solicitors that the collection was too large, that I needed more time, that I would return in the spring to complete the work. they would have believed me. They had no reason not to believe me. They were practical men who dealt in papers and properties and the orderly transfer of assets from the dead to the living, and they had no interest in the fears of a cataloguer who had spent too much time alone with an old man's obsessions. But I did not leave. Something held me. Curiosity, perhaps, or pride, or the particular stubbornness of a man who does not wish to admit that he is afraid. I told myself that the reverend had been an old man, isolated and obsessive, prone to the fantasies of a mind turned too long upon itself. I told myself that the disappearances were coincidences or crimes or accidents that had never been properly investigated, because country villages in those days had neither the resources nor the inclination to look too closely at tragedies they could not explain. I told myself that Black Annis was a story, nothing more, the residue of old fears, given a name and a shape by people who needed to explain the inexplicable. I told myself these things, and I did not believe them. In the days that followed, I began to notice things I had not noticed before. The way the birds fell silent when the wind blew from the direction of the hills. The way the dogs in the village would not look toward the tree line, would not acknowledge with even a whimper or a growl the darkness that rose above the fields. The way the children were kept inside after dusk, not told to come inside but gathered up, collected, herded through doorways with a brisk efficiency that spoke of long practice and deep habit. I noticed the shutters. Every cottage in the village had them, heavy wooden shutters, painted black, fitted with iron hasps that could be secured from inside. They were closed each evening before the last light failed, closed with a uniformity that seemed almost ceremonial, as if the village were performing a ritual whose meaning had been forgotten, but whose form had been preserved. The shutters faced north, toward the hills. The windows that faced south, toward the road and the fields and the world beyond the village, had no shutters at all. I noticed the church. It was old, Norman, or perhaps earlier, its stones gray and weathered and thick. But the windows on the north wall had been bricked up, not recently, but long ago, the mortar as old as the rest of the building. The altar stood against the south wall, rather than the east, as if the congregation could not bear to face the hills even when they came to pray. I noticed the graves. The churchyard sloped gently southward, and all the headstones faced south, away from the hills. The oldest graves were at the southern edge of the yard, as far from the tree line as it was possible to be while remaining on consecrated ground. Only in the last century had the dead been buried closer to the northern boundary, and even then, each stone had been positioned so that it did not face the darkness above. The village had been living with this thing for generations. Every building, every custom, every small daily habit had been shaped by its presence, adapted to its demands, designed to minimize the chances of drawing its attention. The people here did not fight the darkness. They did not try to drive it away or pray it into submission. They simply accommodated it, arranged their lives around it, built their world with their backs to the hills and their eyes fixed firmly on the light. It was not surrender. It was survival. And there was a terrible wisdom in it. A wisdom that had been purchased at a price I was only beginning to understand. 3 weeks into my stay, a child went missing from the village. Her name was Ellen. She was 7 years old, the daughter of a farmer whose land bordered the northern edge of the parish, where the fields gave way to the wilder ground of the Dane Hills. I had seen her twice since my arrival. Once in the village street, walking beside her mother with the solemn concentration of a child who has been told to hold hands and not let go, and once at the edge of the churchyard, watching me with the frank curiosity of youth as I made my way to the rectory. She had fair hair that escaped from beneath her bonnet in wisps and curls, and eyes the color of the November sky, gray, watchful, not quite innocent. She had been playing in the orchard behind her family's cottage. Her mother had seen her there, gathering windfall apples into her apron, moving among the bare trees with the heedless freedom of a child who does not yet know that there are boundaries she should not cross. The orchard was 50 yards from the tree line. 50 yards from the edge of the cultivated land. 50 yards from the place where the warnings began. When her mother looked again, she was gone. The apples were there, scattered across the grass where they had fallen from her apron. Her bonnet was there, caught on a low branch, as if it had been pulled from her head by something passing. But of Ellen herself, there was no sign. No footprints in the soft earth, no cry that anyone had heard, no trail through the grass that might show which way she had gone. She had been there, and then she had not been there, and the world had closed over the place where she had stood as if she had never existed at all. I heard the news at supper. Mrs. Parrish told me in a flat voice, her eyes fixed on the table, her hands folded in her lap with a stillness that seemed deliberate, almost ceremonial. The men were searching, she said. They would search until dark, and then they would search again in the morning. They would find her. Children wandered sometimes. Children got lost. The hills were treacherous, and the woods were deep, and a child could lose her way in 100 innocent ways without anyone being to blame. Will they search the hills? I asked. Mrs. Parrish did not answer. She rose from the table and began clearing the dishes, her movements precise and mechanical. And I understood that I had asked a question that was not meant to be asked. That night, I could not sleep. I lay in my narrow bed and listened to the wind moving through the bare branches outside my window, and I thought about the hollow oak standing guard at the edge of the wood, and the darkness beneath it, and the thing that waited in that darkness with patience older than memory. I thought about the reverend's journal, about the pattern he had traced through centuries of loss, about the hunger that built over years and then demanded to be fed. I thought about Ellen, 7 years old, gathering apples in an orchard 50 yards from the tree line, not knowing that 50 yards was not enough. At some point in the deepest hours of the night, I do not know the hour, but the moon had set and the darkness was complete, I heard a sound. It was distant, carried on the wind from the direction of the hills. A grinding sound, low and rhythmic, like stone against stone, or like teeth. The sound rose and fell with the wind, now louder, now softer, but never quite disappearing, never quite resolving into silence. It pulsed through the darkness like a heartbeat, like the slow breath of something vast and patient. And I lay frozen in my bed and listened and did not move until the first gray light of dawn began to filter through the shutters. I pulled the blanket over my head like a child, and I did not move until morning. Ellen was not found. The search continued for 5 days. Men from the village and the surrounding farms walked the fields and woods in long lines, calling her name until their voices gave out, calling until the words became meaningless sounds, syllables stripped of hope, the desperate incantation of people who knew they were performing a ritual rather than conducting a rescue. They checked the old quarry and the mill pond and the abandoned barns. They searched the hedgerows and the ditches and the hollow beneath the stone bridge where the stream passed under the Leicester Road. They questioned travelers and tinkers and anyone who had passed through the parish in the days before Ellen's disappearance. They did not search the BOWER. I joined the search on the second day. I told myself it was a decent thing to do. A man could not sit cataloging books while a child was missing, could not retreat into the dusty sanctuary of the library while the village emptied itself into the fields. But in truth, I wanted to see. I wanted to watch how they moved through the landscape, how they approached the hills, how they navigated the invisible boundaries they had drawn between the safe world and the dangerous one. I wanted to understand the shape of their fear. I saw it in the way they approached the Dane Hills. The search parties would spread out across the lower slopes, moving efficiently through the bracken and the stands of birch, calling Ellen's name with voices that grew quieter as they climbed. But when they reached the edge of the older wood, the oaks, the area marked on the reverend's map with symbols of loss and warning, they would slow. Their calls would falter. Their steps would hesitate, as if the ground itself had become uncertain beneath their feet. And then they would stop, gathered at an invisible line that only they could see, and turn back. No one spoke about it. No one acknowledged the boundary they would not cross. If asked, and I did ask once or twice, feigning ignorance, they would give vague answers about the difficulty of the terrain, the danger of the cliffs, the way a man could lose his footing in the undergrowth. Practical concerns, rational fears, the kind of thing any sensible person would understand. But their eyes told a different story. Their eyes said that there are places where practical concerns and rational fears are not enough, where the rules of the daylight world give way to older rules, harder rules, rules that cannot be broken without consequence. On the third day, I asked Thomas Croft, not a descendant of the family the Reverend had mentioned, or so he claimed, but a man of the same name and the same face and the same weary set to his shoulders, why no one would enter the deeper wood. He looked at me with eyes that held something I had not seen before in a grown man. Not anger, not grief, not even fear, in the simple sense of the word. What I saw in his eyes was older than fear, a knowledge so deep and so terrible that it had become part of his nature, as unremarkable and as inescapable as the color of his hair or the shape of his hands. "We don't go there," he said. "But if Ellen wandered into the wood, we don't go there." His voice was flat, final, a door closing on a room that would never be opened again. If she's in the wood, she's gone. And there's nothing to be done? How can you be certain? If there's even a chance, there's no chance. He turned away from me, his shoulders set against my questions, against the hills, against the knowledge that lived in his bones and could not be spoken aloud. There never was. He walked away before I could ask anything else, and I stood at the edge of the wood and looked at the hollow oak, black against the gray November sky. Its branches creaked in the wind, a sound like old hinges or aching joints, and the opening at its base was darker than it should have been, darker than the shadow of the branches could account for, darker than any absence of light. I thought about walking forward. I thought about crossing the boundary that no one else would cross, entering the wood, finding the cave the Reverend had described. I thought about what I might find there, the scratched walls, the soft floor, the thing that waited in the deepest darkness with its vast talons and its livid face and its hunger that had been building for years. I thought about Ellen. I did not move. On the 5th day, they called off the search. There was no announcement, no formal decision. People simply stopped looking. The farmer whose daughter was missing returned to his fields. The men who had walked the hills went back to their trades. Ellen's name, which had been on every tongue for a week, ceased to be spoken, and the silence that followed was so complete that it was as if she had never existed at all. I watched the village close itself around the wound. I watched the mothers pull their children a little closer, the fathers check the shutters a little earlier, the old people shake their heads with a weariness that spoke of accumulated loss, of grief that had become habitual. I watched them not speak Ellen's name, not mention her to strangers, not allow themselves the dangerous luxury of remembering what they had lost. This was how they survived. This was the price of their accommodation with the darkness above them. They grieved, and then they forgot, and then they continued, because the alternative was to acknowledge a truth that could not be lived with, a reality that would drive any sane person to madness or flight. The forgetting was not weakness. It was wisdom. It was the hard-won understanding of generations who had learned that some battles cannot be won, some evils cannot be defeated, and the only victory available is the victory of endurance. I returned to the library. I continued my cataloging, my hands moving through the motions of sorting and listing while my mind wandered the darker paths of the reverend's journal. I read his entries again and again, searching for something I had missed, some clue or pattern or hint that might make sense of what I had witnessed. I studied his annotations on the folklore, his careful cross-references, his symbols and codes. I learned the patterns he had learned, the timing of the disappearances, the locations from which children had vanished, the slow, patient rhythm of something that was not quite random and not quite predictable. And I began to understand something he had only hinted at in his final entries. The village knew. They had always known. Not in the way modern people know things, with evidence and logic and the confidence of science, but in the older way, the way of bone and blood and memory. They knew that something lived beneath the Dane Hills, something that had been there before the Romans came, before the Celts raised their standing stones, before the first men learned to fear the dark. They knew that it could not be fought, or reasoned with, or driven away. They knew that it demanded a price, and that the price had to be paid. The warnings, the closed shutters, the children kept indoors after dark, the paths that were not walked and the woods that were not entered were not superstition. They were strategy. They were the accumulated wisdom of centuries of survival, passed down from parent to child in the form of rules that seemed arbitrary, but were anything but. Every closed shutter was a shield. Every unwalked path was a boundary. Every forgotten name was a sacrifice to the thing that waited beneath the hill, an offering of memory in exchange for life. The village had made a kind of peace with Black Annis. Not a treaty. You cannot negotiate with hunger, but an understanding, a careful balance of caution and acceptance that had allowed them to survive where others might have fled or been destroyed. They did not provoke it. They did not acknowledge it. They lived their lives as carefully as they could, kept their children close, closed their shutters against the dark, and when the price was demanded, when a child wandered too far, or a traveler took the wrong path, or the hunger beneath the hill grew too great to be contained, they grieved and they forgot and they continued. It was not victory. It was not even survival, in the triumphant sense that word implies. It was endurance. The slow, grinding persistence of people who have learned that some battles cannot be won, only outlasted. 3 weeks after Ellen's disappearance, on the last night of November, I woke to silence. Not the ordinary silence of a sleeping village. I had grown accustomed to that, the peace of a place where people went to bed with the sun and rose with it, where the nights were long and dark and still. This was different. This was the silence the Reverend had described in his journal, the silence he had encountered at the edge of the wood, a silence so complete that it seemed to have weight and texture, pressing against the windows like something trying to get in, filling the room like water rising from an unseen source. I lay in the darkness and listened. No wind, no settling of the old cottage's timbers, no sound of birds or foxes or the distant lowing of cattle. No creak of branches, no rustle of leaves, no whisper of air moving through the bare hedgerows. Nothing. The world had fallen silent, as if it were holding its breath, as if it were waiting for something to pass. And then, from the direction of the Dane Hills, the grinding began. It was louder than before, louder than it had any right to be, as if the thing making the sound were closer, or larger, or simply no longer troubling to conceal itself. The rhythm was slow and deliberate, like millstones turning, like bones being ground to powder, like teeth working against teeth in the darkness of a vast and hungry mouth. It pulsed through the silence like a heartbeat, and I realized with a cold certainty that what I was hearing had been heard in these hills for thousands of years by people who had no name for it, and no understanding of it, and no defense against it except the frail walls of their homes and the desperate hope that they would not be chosen. I rose from my bed. I do not know why. Some compulsion moved me, not curiosity, not courage, but something older and less rational, a summons I could not refuse, a pull toward the thing I feared most. I crossed to the window and put my hand on the shutter. Mrs. Parrish had warned me not to open the shutters after dark. It was one of her rules, delivered without explanation in the same flat tone she used for all her pronouncements. I had thought it a superstition, a holdover from an earlier time when people believed that darkness could enter a home like a thief if the barriers were not maintained. But standing there in the silence, listening to the grinding sound pulse through the night, I understood that it was not superstition. It was survival. I opened the shutter anyway. The moon was full, and its light lay silver on the fields, transforming the familiar landscape into something strange and cold and ancient. The trees on the Dane Hills stood stark and black against the sky, their branches motionless despite the winter that should have been moving through them. The silence was absolute. No owl called, no fox barked, no sound of any kind broke the vast stillness of the night. And at the edge of the wood, where the hollow oak stood guard over the entrance to the bower, I saw something that made me forget how to breathe. A figure was standing beneath the oak. It was tall, taller than any person had a right to be, its proportions wrong in ways I could not immediately name. Its limbs were too long, jointed in too many places, folded against its body with a geometry that hurt to look at. Its back was bent, hunched, as if it were carrying a great weight or simply accustomed to moving through spaces too small for its true size. And even at that distance, even in the uncertain silver light of the moon, I could see that its skin was the color of a bruise, the color of thunderclouds, the color of something that had never known the warmth of the sun. It was looking at the village. I stood frozen at the window, unable to move, unable to look away, unable to do anything but stare at the thing on the hill and feel the cold certainty of its attention settling over the cottages below. The figure did not move. It simply stood there, patient as stone, watching the darkened windows and the shuttered houses and the smoke rising from the last embers of the evening's fires. And I understood, in that moment, that this was what vigilance looked like. Not the sharp attention of a predator about to strike, but the endless patience of something that knew it had all the time in the world. It had watched this village for 1,000 years. It would watch for 1,000 more. The lives that flickered and faded in the cottages below were nothing to it. Candles in the wind, momentary warmths in the long, cold darkness of its existence. The grinding sound continued, rising and falling like breath. I do not know how long I stood there. Minutes, hours. Time had become strange, stretched thin by fear, and I had no way of measuring its passage. But at some point, when the moon had shifted in the sky and the shadows had moved across the fields and the cold had seeped into my bones until I could no longer feel my hands on the windowsill, the figure turned away. It moved toward the hollow oak, its gait unhurried, its long limbs folding and unfolding in ways that hurt to watch. It passed beneath the branches of the oak, into the darkness at the tree's base, and was gone. The shadow swallowed it, or it became the shadow, or it descended into whatever waited below. I could not tell, and it did not matter. It was gone, and the night was empty, and the silence remained. The grinding had stopped. I closed the shutter. I returned to my bed. I did not sleep again that night, or the next after that. I left the village the following morning. I told Mrs. Parrish that urgent business had called me back to London. A family matter, I said, too complicated to explain. She looked at me with eyes that knew I was lying. Eyes that had seen other strangers come to this village and leave before their work was done. Eyes that understood exactly what had driven me away and did not blame me for it. She said nothing. She packed me a lunch for the journey, wrapped in brown paper and tied with string, and stood in the doorway as I walked down the lane toward the road. "Safe travels," she said. And then, so quietly, I almost didn't hear, "Don't come back." I did not look back at the Dane Hills as I walked. I did not let myself look. But I knew that the hollow oak was there, standing at the edge of the wood as it had stood for centuries, its branches reaching toward the sky like the fingers of a grasping hand. I knew that the bower waited beneath it, patient as stone, its walls scored with the marks of iron fingernails, its floor soft with the accumulated matter of generations. And I knew that the thing I had seen, the figure with its wrong proportions and its bruised dark skin, its endless patience and its grinding teeth, was watching me go. It let me leave. I do not know why. Perhaps I was never in danger. The reverend had suggested that it preferred the young, and I was past 30, my flesh already beginning the slow surrender to age. Perhaps it was simply not hungry, its appetite sated by whatever had happened to Ellen in the days before my departure. Or perhaps it understood, in whatever way such a thing can understand, that I would do what the reverend had done before me. I would remember, and I would write, and I would pass on the warning to those who came after. The catalogue of the reverend's library was never completed. The solicitors wrote to me several times, requesting an update on my progress, expressing concern at my sudden departure, offering to increase my fee if I would return to finish the work. I did not reply. Eventually, they hired someone else. A younger man, I was told, eager for the commission, confident in his abilities. I do not know what became of him. I did not ask. I returned to London. I took other commissions. I catalogued other libraries, the collections of scholars and eccentrics, the accumulated wisdom and folly of lives spent among books. I did not speak of what I had seen in Leicestershire. I did not write of it. The years passed, and the memory faded, and I almost convinced myself that it had been a dream, a fantasy, the product of too much solitude and too many hours spent reading an old man's obsessions. Almost. I am an old man now, and I have thought often of what I learned in that village at the foot of the Dane Hills. I have wondered whether I was right to leave, or whether I should have stayed, whether there was something I could have done, some action I could have taken, some courage I could have summoned that might have made a difference. But I know there was nothing. The Reverend Edmund Ashworth understood this. He spent 60 years in that village, watching the pattern repeat, documenting the losses, recording the names that were never spoken, and the grief that was never acknowledged. He entered the bower and saw what waited there, and he came out again. And he never once tried to fight the thing beneath the hill. Not because he was a coward, not because he lacked faith, but because he understood what I came to understand in my time in that place, that some evils cannot be defeated. They can only be remembered, respected, and survived. Black Annis is not a story. She is not a metaphor, or a symbol, or a remnant of older beliefs dressed up in the trappings of folklore. She is a truth, old and patient and hungry, waiting beneath the limestone in her cave of scratched walls, waiting for the children who wander too far, and the travelers who take the wrong path, and the proud modern men who do not believe in the darkness that was old when their ancestors were young. The scholars say she is a corruption of the goddess Anu, the Celtic mother of gods, transformed by time and fear into something terrible. Perhaps they are right. Perhaps she was worshipped once, offered sacrifices, appeased with blood and prayer. Perhaps there was a time when men understood what she was and gave her what she needed, and in return she gave them the only gift she had, the gift of being left alone. But those times are gone. The old knowledge has been forgotten, or repackaged as superstition, or dismissed by people who believe that the world is made only of things that can be measured and explained. The villages at the edge of the Dane Hills have learned to survive without understanding, to endure without knowledge, to carry on the rituals of protection without remembering why the rituals were created. They close their shutters. They keep their children close. They do not walk on the hills after dark, and they endure. I write this account not as a confession or a warning, but as an act of remembrance. The Reverend Ashworth kept the truth alive in his library, in his marginalia, and his journal, and his careful maps. Now he is gone, and the library has been scattered, and soon there will be no one left who knows what waits beneath the Dane Hills. No one left who understands the price that must be paid for living in the shadow of something older than memory. So I am telling you, if you find yourself in Leicestershire in a village whose name you cannot quite remember, at the foot of hills that rise towards something darker than trees, do not walk there after dark. Do not approach the hollow oak at the wood's edge. Do not enter the forest when the world falls silent and the grinding begins. Close your shutters. Bar your doors. Keep the children close. And remember that fear, sometimes, is the only wisdom we have. Last winter, I received a letter from a solicitor in Leicester. The firm had changed hands several times since my aborted commission, but they had found my name in their files and thought I might be interested in some news concerning the property I had once been hired to catalog. The Reverend Ashworth's library, they informed me, had been sold at auction some years ago. The books dispersed to collectors across the country. The papers donated to a local historical society. The building itself converted into a private residence by a family from Birmingham who wanted a quiet place to escape the noise of the city. But that was not the news they wished to share. The village, they told me, had been abandoned. The younger generation had left for the cities years ago, drawn by the promise of work and wages, and a life beyond the narrow lanes and the watchful hills. The old people, Mrs. Parrish among them, I presume, though her name was not mentioned, had died or been moved to care homes in the larger towns, their cottages left to fall into disrepair. The church had been deconsecrated, its contents removed to a museum in Leicester, its windows finally facing in all directions now that there was no one left to remember why they had once faced only south. The land had been bought by a development company. They planned to build holiday homes for walkers and tourists, the solicitor explained. Tasteful conversions of the old cottages, new construction sympathetic to the character of the area. The Dane Hills were to be designated a nature reserve, with marked trails and information boards and a visitor center at the old railway station. The hollow oak, the letter noted, had been marked as a site of historical interest. There was talk of building a viewing platform. I put down the letter and looked out my window at the gray London sky. I thought about the village I had left so many years ago, its careful silences, its unspoken rules, its ancient and terrible accommodation with the thing beneath the hill. I thought about the warnings that had been passed down through generations, the knowledge that had kept people alive, even as it cost them something essential, the shutters and the paths and the names that were never spoken. All of it gone now. All of it forgotten. I thought about the tourists who would come, with their walking boots and their picnic hampers and their confident ignorance of everything the old people had known. They would rent the converted cottages and walk the marked trails and take photographs of the hollow oak to show their friends. They would let their children run ahead on the paths, would laugh at the old superstitions mentioned on the information boards, would stay out after dark because the sunset over the Dane Hills was particularly beautiful, and what could possibly be dangerous about a nature reserve? They would not close the shutters, because the cottages would no longer have shutters. They would not keep their children close, because there would be no one left to tell them why they should. They would not fear the darkness, because fear is old-fashioned, and modern people do not believe in things that cannot be measured and explained. And some of them, not many, perhaps not at first, will go missing. A child who wandered too far from the holiday cottage. A walker who left the marked trail to investigate an interesting outcrop of limestone. A photographer who stayed out past dusk to capture the perfect shot of the hollow oak silhouetted against the dying light. The searches will find nothing. The police will investigate, will interview witnesses, will comb the hills with dogs and drones, and all the technology that the old villagers never had. The newspapers will speculate about accidents and foul play and the treacherous terrain of the hills, and eventually the cases will go cold, and the families will grieve, and the world will move on. And beneath the limestone, in the darkness of the BOWER, something old and patient will grind its teeth and wait. It has waited before. Through centuries of fear and forgetting, through the rise and fall of kingdoms, through the slow erosion of belief and the steady march of progress. It waited when the Romans came and when they left. It waited when the churches were built and when they were abandoned. It waited through plagues and wars and the long, quiet years between, patient as the stone it dwells in, hungry as the darkness it inhabits. It can wait again. It has all the time in the world. And somewhere, in the Dane Hills, beneath the hollow oak that tourists photograph and children climb, a cave waits to be discovered. Its walls are scored with long, parallel grooves, as if something has clawed at them for centuries. Its floor is soft, with the accumulated matter of generations. And in the deepest darkness, something stirs, something with vast talons and a livid face and iron fingernails and a hunger that has been building for years. Something that remembers, even when the world forgets. Something that waits. Something that is always, always hungry. The end. Thank you for listening to the tale of Black Annis by Mikey of Saltlinesstudio. If you enjoyed this story, please like, subscribe, and share. Until next time, keep your salt lines drawn.